During an April 1844 General Conference, Joseph Smith told the saints that he wanted to find a writ of habeas corpus for the dead. In a 3-hour sermon, Smith cited numerous biblical passages, including those found in Obadiah 1, 1 Peter 3, and 1 Corinthians 15, to show the biblical grounding of the teaching that the saints could save their fathers and mothers, brothers, sisters, and friends. While uncovering the scriptural and spiritual foundation of baptism for the dead, Smith used a legal analogy to underscore the practice's power. Observing that the saints know what a habeas corpus means, he related a tale of 2 individuals, one who was imprisoned for lying, swindling, and deceiving, and the other who, through some embarrassment, is involved in debt, is seized under the same law, and is put in the same prison. The innocent man is taken from town many miles off and suffers without hope. But a friend searches the law and finds a habeas corpus, and, doing what the other man cannot do for himself, the friend pays the money and gets the receipt in the presence of witnesses and gets it recorded, and goes to the prison and looses the prisoner, who falls on his bosom and thanks him for his liberty and freedom. Smith saw a clear parallel between writs of habeas corpus and the records of baptism for the dead, which he taught could be used to free prisoners in another clime. While Smith's teachings on the power of ritual records grew out of his early 1830s revelations, which identified baptism and bodies and matter and media as essential to salvation, he only developed these ideas in the early 1840s, when he learned the legal value of the writ of habeas corpus. During this time, the specter of Missouri, in the form of renewed extradition efforts, continued to haunt Smith. In response to this new threat, the saints pursued practical legal measures, which included the city council's creation of new ordinances on habeas corpus. As the saints pursued legal means to protect Smith, those means, in turn, appear to have informed the development of teachings aimed at more than temporal salvation. In short, the limiting contexts of the summer and fall of 1842 functioned as a launching pad for soaring teachings and practices about baptism for the dead, which aimed at forever overcoming those limiting contexts. This paper, then, posits a relationship between the temporal threat of extradition and Smith's mature teachings on the salvific role of rituals and records. I am not arguing that baptism for the dead or related teachings originated in the extradition efforts, but rather that those efforts provided an incubator for these ideas. The ontology introduced in Smith's revelations yielded theological resolutions that paralleled and sometimes overlapped with practical ones. The insight that bodies and matter were fundamental to both temporal and eternal existence meant that practical answers sometimes corresponded with revealed ones. The idea that matter constituted a core component of both temporal and eternal existence made it possible to view records as the basis of both securing Smith's temporal safety and ensuring the dead's eternal salvation. I argue that Smith's use of habeas corpus contributed to the shape of his teachings on record keeping and baptism for the dead, practices which promised to eternally resolve the saints' temporal insecurities in ways that corresponded with, but also exceeded their practical efforts. A number of events related to the second extradition attempt highlight the connection between the saints' temporal contexts, their practical responses to outside threats, and Smith's spiritual teachings. The second extradition resulted from an attempted assassination. On May 6th, former Missouri Governor Lilburn Boggs was shot at his home in Independence, Missouri. Within weeks, unsubstantiated rumors suggested that Smith had ordered Orrin Porter Rockwell to kill Boggs. Recognizing that these accusations might result in an effort to force Smith to Missouri to stand trial, the saints prepared to protect their prophet. They did this, in part, by passing an ordinance in July that gave the municipal court power to grant writs of habeas corpus in all cases under the city laws, and that guaranteed Nauvoo citizens a right to trial in Nauvoo. Just over a month later, Smith made use of the new law. On August 8, 1842, Thomas King, undersheriff of Adams County, Illinois, arrived in Nauvoo with 2 other officers and arrested Rockwell for attempted murder and Smith as an accessory before the fact. Smith and Rockwell both immediately petitioned for a writ of habeas corpus from the municipal court. Around noon, Nauvoo City Council quickly convened and passed a new ordinance that directed the municipal court to examine the legality of arrests made in Nauvoo, and further gave the court power to discharge arrested persons if it determined the warrant to be illegal or malicious. The ordinance also allowed the court to select a temporary chief justice in cases where the existing chief justice, Smith in this instance, was absent. At about 1 p.m., the court met and, in light of the new ordinance, elected Orson Spencer to act as chief justice in Smith's place. In response to Smith's and Rockwell's positions, Spencer then issued orders for the 2 of them to be presented to the court, and the city marshal delivered the orders to King between 2 and 3 p.m. Uncertain about how to proceed, King and the other officers left Smith and Rockwell in the hands of City Marshal Henry Sherwood and returned to Illinois Governor Thomas Carlin, who had signed the arrest warrant, for further instruction. The court's election of Spencer and its decision to grant writs of habeas corpus indicated the power of authorizing an individual to act on the behalf of another and of issuing documents that released individuals from unjust imprisonment. While Smith used legal means, he did not fully trust in them, and so he turned to his friends for help. When the arresting officers left Nauvoo, Smith and Rockwell crossed the Mississippi River to Zarahemla, Iowa Territory, where they hid in the home of Thomas King, a church member who, ironically, had the same name as the undersheriff. Over the next few days, Smith continued to hide out with the assistance of King. According to King's reminiscent account, late on August 9th, Smith and Rockwell asked King for help in secretly returning to Nauvoo. King secured a skiff and oars and rowed them across the Mississippi River. Smith met with friends and family and made plans for how to proceed. At about 2 a.m., he and King rowed back across the Mississippi. After arriving at King's home, Smith put his arm around King's neck and said, "I have found another true friend." The next day, on August 11th, Smith had to flee from King's home when men approached in search of him. King's effort on Smith's behalf put him in a position to perform sacred rituals for the benefit of his kindred dead. On August 27th, just a few weeks after helping Smith, King donated wheat and flour as a tithe. Smith's clerk, William Clayton, recorded King's donation in the Book of the Law of the Lord. Then, on Smith's behalf, Clayton wrote and signed an authorization for King to use the baptismal font in the basement of the unfinished Nauvoo temple. There, King and other members who had offered tithes likely presented their authorizations in order to perform baptisms for their deceased ancestors. Soon after King had helped resolve an immediate threat to Joseph's life, he donated material goods, which generated a document that gave him access to the spiritual means of assisting his kindred dead. In this setting, Smith taught the saints the importance of keeping records of baptism for the dead, which related to his prior instructions on recording the saints' donations. At Smith's instruction, Willard Richards had created the Book of the Law of the Lord in late 1841. This record had roots in directions Smith had given in an 1832 letter to William W. Phelps, in which Smith explained that the church's clerk must record the names of all those who consecrate properties, and also record their manner of life and their faith and works. Perhaps Richards had this teaching in mind in December of 1841 when he began to record the saints' names and donations in the Book of the Law of the Lord. The saints' donations contributed to the construction of the temple, where King and other tithed saints showed their authorizations to perform baptisms for their dearly departed dead. In August of 1842, just days before King received his authorization to perform baptisms, Smith had reflected on the actions of other loyal saints and had said their names aloud. On the 16th, and a week later on the 23rd, while absent friends and family, both dead and alive, Smith spoke their names for William Clayton to record in the Book of the Law of the Lord. He began by blessing Erastus Derby, who was staying with Smith and assisting him by carrying correspondence to and from Smith. After blessing Derby, Smith named others who had helped him during his current crisis, before also referencing individuals who had assisted him throughout his life, including his deceased brother Alvin. Rather than provide a comprehensive list, Smith mentioned those who were emblematical of the many people who had come to his aid. In this act of recording their names, Smith brought loved ones close through memory, as well as through pen and ink. This was the creation of a media that secured more than temporal safety. Smith stated that these are the ones that shall inherit eternal life. Just a few weeks later, while still avoiding extradition, Smith provided new instructions that valued record keeping as crucial to the process of saving the dead. While hiding at the house of Edward Hunter, he dictated 2 September letters to the saints. In his September 1st letter, Smith began by noting that he had left his affairs with agents and clerks who would transact all business on his behalf. Smith's professional staff performed many tasks for him during this period. This work yielded numerous documents, including these September letters. As John Durham Peters observes, by mentioning agents working on his behalf, Smith foreshadowed the central message of his correspondence to the saints: baptism for the dead. He had already used the word agents to discuss this ritual in prior sermons. In a discourse given in March, for example, Smith had explained that an individual could act as an agent and be baptized for the remission of sins for and in behalf of his dead kindred. During this period, when Smith turned to others to perform various duties in his name, the idea that individuals could act as agents for others became crucial to his teachings on salvation for the dead. Smith himself acknowledged the role that his own immediate circumstances played in helping him formulate these thoughts. In his September 1st letter, he stated that persecution had become familiar to him. He said, "Deep water is what I am wont to swim in. It all has become second nature to me, and I feel like Paul to glory in tribulation. I shall triumph over all my enemies, for the Lord God hath spoken it." While hiding from officers who attempted to send him back to Missouri, Smith recalled the words the Lord had spoken to him while imprisoned there. In jail, Smith had learned the close tie between suffering and salvation, between the lows of temporal life and the highs of a communion with God that led to eternal exaltation. He made the same connection in his 1st September letter to the saints, telling them, "If they persecute you, so persecuted they the prophets. For all this, there is a reward in heaven." Contexts of suffering directed Smith to consider justice and salvation beyond his temporal setting. In prior revelations and teachings, including in his 1839 letters from prison, Smith had hinted at the importance of record keeping in not only securing justice for the wicked, but also in ensuring salvation for the righteous. He now built on those ideas, emphasizing the need for recorders to witness baptisms for the dead, and to record what they saw with their eyes and heard with their ears. Smith insisted that the power of the resulting records transcended their temporal contexts. The records on earth would be reflected in heaven. What was bound on earth would be bound in heaven, and what was loosed on earth would be loosed in heaven. Smith's statement suggested that the records had the power to loose or release those in spirit prison, just as a writ of habeas corpus had loosed or released him from detainment. While Smith outlined eternal resolutions to temporal problems, those problems appear to have helped him articulate his teachings on the value of ritual records. Indeed, these teachings suggested that record keeping itself was a kind of ritual. As the letters ritualized the practice of keeping records, writing the letters initiated a process of creating canon. Smith's temporal context limited what he could teach the saints, but at the same time, it ensured that there would be a record of what he taught. Toward the end of his September 1st letter, Smith expressed his great desire to have addressed the saints on the subject of baptism for the dead on the following Sabbath, but, he explained, "Inasmuch as it is out of my power to do so, I will write the word of the Lord." Smith could not write all he wanted to and had to close his letter for the want of more time. Smith implied that he would have written more on the topic, or rather dictated more on the topic, if circumstances had permitted, but he also suggested that the very nature of the limiting context had inspired him to create a written record. This ensured the endurance of his message. Both of the September letters to the saints were recorded in the Book of the Law of the Lord, which also served as Joseph's journal, printed in the Times and Seasons, and published in the 1844 edition of the Doctrine and Covenants. About a week after sending his first missive to the saints, Smith dictated another letter on baptism for the dead and the importance of record keeping. He observed that the subject of baptism for the dead seems to occupy my mind and press itself upon my feelings the strongest since I have been pursued by mine enemies. Perhaps Smith's temporary isolation from friends and family inspired him to think about practices that could eternally secure relationships. At the same time that extradition threatened to make permanent his separation from loved ones, he brought them close through correspondence and described a set of practices with power to bind the saints together in another realm. In his second letter, Smith indicated the need for multiple recorders. Those recorders would turn over their records to a general church recorder who would enter the record on the general church book. The recorders stood in for the general recorder, and, Smith explained, the general record shall be just as holy and shall answer the ordinance just the same as if the general recorder himself had witnessed the baptisms. Smith had come to understand the necessity of agents, clerks, and recorders who assisted him with myriad administrative, financial, and legal issues, and produced and signed documents that were just as valid as if he himself had created and signed them. Now, he drew on that understanding and experience to emphasize the spiritual significance of recorders and the documents they created. Smith imbued the records of ritual with incredible value. He connected them to the books spoken of in Revelation 20. These books contained a record of the works of the dead which are kept on the earth, while the book of life referred to the record which is kept in heaven. Smith further indicated that the record in heaven depended on the records on earth, noting that whatsoever you record on earth shall be recorded in heaven. In other words, the records in heaven were apparently incomplete without the records on earth. Smith explained that because of these records, whether the dead themselves have attended to the ordinances in their own propria persona, or by means of their own agents, they could receive salvation. Smith's worldly understanding of the value of agents and records aided him in teaching the saints about baptism for the dead. Smith recognized the radical nature of his teaching. He admitted, it may seem to some to be a very bold doctrine that we talk of, a power which records or binds on earth and binds in heaven. He asserted that these ideas conformed to the ordinance that the Lord ordained and prepared before the foundation of the world. In making this point, Smith explained that baptism, which imitated burial and resurrection, was instituted to form a relationship with the ordinance of baptism for the dead. The ordinance for the dead, in other words, had given shape to the ordinance for the living. So while Smith insisted on the premortal origins of baptism for the dead, he also suggested that the temporal, or the earthly, had shaped the spiritual. He cited Paul's teaching in 1 Corinthians 15 that the earthly preceded the heavenly, and connected this idea to his teaching on records, noting, as are the records on the earth in relation to your dead, which are truly made out, so also are the records in heaven. Smith's teaching envisioned a succession of bodies and documents that bridged the living and the dead. Individuals acted on behalf of the deceased by being baptized for them. By using their own bodies in this way, human beings themselves became sacraments, as Sound Brown notes. But the sacramental act also had to be materially recorded and transmitted. Recorders participated in this process. They were the eyes and ears and hands of the general recorder, who used their records to make a general record. That general record corresponded to the book of life, which would be used to free spirits from prison and allow them to enter into exaltation. This process gave unique value to bodies, but also to records. As John Durham Peters explains, Smith's instructions gave the records themselves ontological status. Records on earth would stand in for the dead in heaven, demanding that those without bodies be judged according to works done in the flesh, thus making them legal candidates of a celestial inheritance. Smith articulated these bold teachings in the midst of extradition attempts, which led the Nauvoo City Council to pass brazen laws bolstering the right to habeas corpus. In September and November of 1842, the City Council gave the municipal court greater power to adjudicate habeas corpus cases. The November ordinance conveyed the importance of making careful records and outlined the power those records had in bringing bodies before the court. In short, it aimed to save individuals from unjust detainment. If Smith's prior use of the right of habeas corpus had shaped his teachings on baptism for the dead, perhaps those teachings in turn informed the saints' efforts to bolster that right. Smith continued to make use of habeas corpus. In late December, he petitioned for a writ of habeas corpus to secure a hearing before Nathaniel Pope of the United States Circuit Court for the District of Illinois. This allowed Smith to aver before the court that he was not a fugitive from the justice of the state of Missouri. Smith's attorney, Justin Butterfield, argued to this effect, and Pope ruled that Smith must be discharged. This did not conclude Missouri's attempt to extradite Smith, and these endeavors continued to reinforce the power habeas corpus, these endeavors continued to reinforce the right to habeas corpus, which Smith continued to use in the final months and days of his life. In the April 1844 conference, Smith told the saints that he wanted to find a writ of habeas corpus for the dead. He had discovered one in the summer of 1842. In his 1844 sermon, he wondered how poor, blind, ignorant, and ungodly lawgivers who devise a plan to save the body deny the eternal God of devising a plan for redeeming the spirit of the prisoner who has died in another clime. Smith's temporal context of extradition and his use of habeas corpus in that context inspired him to develop teachings and practices meant to save prisoners in a heavenly clime. Thank you.